March 28, 1945. The Rhineland. A cold rain fell across the ruined village of Brechen, turning its cobblestones to mirrors that reflected the gray sky. Staff Sergeant Jack Brennan, 26 years old and bone-tired, stood outside what remained of the town hall, watching as his platoon herded 17 German soldiers into the makeshift prisoner collection point. The captured men moved slowly, their heads down, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and something else Jack had learned to recognize in recent weeks: fear. The war in Europe was ending. Everyone knew it now, even these remnants of the Wehrmacht, scraped together from units that no longer existed on any operational map. But knowing the war was ending and surviving to see its conclusion were different matters entirely. These men had heard the stories. They had read Goebbels' proclamations about American brutality, about mass executions, about a merciless enemy who showed no quarter. Jack watched as Private Russell Gaines, a farm kid from Nebraska, gestured for the Germans to sit against the wall beneath the overhang. The prisoners hesitated, uncertain whether compliance would help or hurt them. One man, perhaps 40 years old with a bandage wrapped around his left hand, kept glancing toward the door as if calculating whether he could reach it before the Americans opened fire. Another, barely old enough to shave, began to shake visibly despite the relative shelter from the rain. "Easy," Jack said quietly in German, surprising himself with how naturally the language came now after months of interrogations and processing. "Sit. You won't be harmed." The older German stared at him, trying to determine whether this was some kind of trap. His lips moved as if forming a question he dared not speak aloud. Jack had been with the Third Army since Normandy. He had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. But in recent weeks, as the Wehrmacht collapsed and prisoners poured into American lines by the thousands, he had witnessed something that troubled him more than combat itself. These captured soldiers arrived expecting execution, expecting torture, expecting confirmation of every propaganda nightmare their government had fed them for years. Instead, they found hot coffee, cigarettes, medical care, and an abundance that made no sense to men who had been starving in foxholes. "Corporal Henderson," Jack called to a stocky soldier sorting through captured documents. "Get these men some water, and see if the field kitchen has any extra rations." Henderson, who had been complaining about the rain for the past hour, looked up sharply. "Sergeant, you heard me. Water and food." The 17 Germans watched this exchange with visible confusion. The young one had stopped shaking, but now wore an expression of such profound bewilderment that Jack almost smiled. This was not how prisoners of a cruel and merciless enemy were supposed to be treated. Lieutenant Edmund Howell appeared in the doorway, his uniform somehow still crisp despite the weather. He was new to the unit, arrived just 3 days ago as a replacement after their previous platoon leader caught shrapnel outside Koblenz. "Sergeant Brennan, I need you inside. Division wants a preliminary count and condition assessment on all POWs collected today." Jack nodded and followed the lieutenant into what had once been the town administrator's office. A single oil lamp provided light in the windowless room. Maps covered one wall, marked with the rapid advance of Patton's army deeper into Germany. "How many total today?" Howell asked, pulling out a notebook. 43 so far, these 17, plus the 26 we processed this morning. Most are in reasonable condition, considering. Some minor wounds, malnutrition, exposure, nothing critical." Jack paused. "They're terrified, sir." Howell looked up from his notes. "Terrified? They think we're going to execute them. Every one of them. They've been told we murder prisoners, that American soldiers are savages." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. He was young, perhaps 23, with the kind of idealism that combat hadn't yet fully tempered. "That's Reich propaganda. Standard fare." "Yes, sir. But they believe it. That kid out there, the young one? He's shaking so hard he can barely stand. And the older man with the bandaged hand keeps watching me like I'm about to pull my sidearm." Howell set down his pen. "What do you suggest, Sergeant?" Jack had been thinking about this for days, watching the pattern repeat itself with each group of prisoners. Fear, confusion, then slow dawning comprehension that contradicted everything they had been told about their enemy. "We treat them the way we're already treating them, sir. We give them food, water, medical care. We let them see that everything they've been told is a lie. And we start with those 17 out there." Outside, the rain continued to fall. Corporal Henderson had returned with canteens and had distributed them to the prisoners. The Germans accepted the water with trembling hands, each man apparently convinced that this kindness was some elaborate prelude to execution. They drank carefully, watching the Americans for any sign of what was to come. Private Gaines stood guard near the door, his rifle slung over his shoulder in a casual posture that suggested no immediate threat. He was young, barely 20, but he had learned the same lessons Jack had learned. These captured soldiers were not the fanatics who had fought them in Normandy or the desperate SS troops who still resisted with suicidal determination. These were conscripts and old men, boys and factory workers, the last scrapings of a collapsing regime. The German with the bandaged hand finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Where are you taking us?" Jack, who had remained outside beneath the overhang, answered in German. "To a processing center, then to a POW camp. And then? And then you wait for the war to end." The man's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "That is all?" "That is all." Silence followed this exchange. The 17 prisoners looked at each other, communicating without words. The young one who had been shaking finally spoke up, his voice cracking. "We were told that Americans kill all prisoners, that you would torture us first, then shoot us." Jack had heard variations of this statement dozens of times. He no longer felt anger at the propaganda that had poisoned these men's minds. Instead, he felt something closer to pity. "You were told lies." A field kitchen truck arrived, its canvas cover dark with rain. 2 cooks began unloading equipment, preparing to set up a hot meal for the American troops and, following recent directives from command, for prisoners as well. The smell of coffee began to drift through the wet air, a scent so ordinary and yet so powerful in its implications. The German prisoners watched as Corporal Henderson returned with a wooden crate. He set it down and opened it to reveal C-ration boxes, crackers, canned meat, chocolate bars. Henderson began distributing the rations mechanically, handing 1 box to each prisoner without comment or ceremony. The older German stared at the box in his hands as if it were some kind of explosive device. "Why?" he finally asked, looking up at Jack. "Why what? Why are you feeding us? Why give us anything? We are your enemy." Jack considered his answer carefully. Around him, his platoon continued their work, processing paperwork, securing weapons, preparing for the night. The war had become routine in its way, a series of tasks performed with exhaustion-dulled efficiency. But this moment, this question, felt significant in a way he could not quite articulate. "Because the war is ending," Jack said finally. "And because you're human beings." The German's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to something that might have been grief. His hands began to shake, and the C-ration box nearly fell before he caught it. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "For 2 years they told us you were monsters, that Americans were devils without mercy, that if we were captured, we would die in agony." Jack said nothing. There was nothing to say that the food and water and basic human decency had not already communicated more effectively than words. The young German who had been shaking earlier opened his ration box with trembling fingers. He pulled out a chocolate bar, stared at it for a long moment, then began to cry. The sound was soft, almost inaudible beneath the rain, but the other prisoners heard it. Several looked away, their own faces tight with suppressed emotion. Lieutenant Howell emerged from the town hall and surveyed the scene. He watched the prisoners eating, watched their faces as they processed the disconnect between what they had expected and what they were experiencing. "Jesus," he muttered quietly to Jack. "How long have they believed that about us?" "Long enough that they're surprised to be alive, sir." A medical corpsman arrived, a thin man named Davies who had been with the unit since France. He carried his aid bag and moved among the prisoners, checking the bandaged hand, examining a nasty bruise on another man's temple, offering aspirin and antiseptic with the same professional detachment he showed to wounded Americans. The Germans submitted to his ministrations with bewilderment, as if medical care for enemy prisoners was an impossibility their minds could not quite process. As darkness began to fall, Lieutenant Howell ordered the prisoners moved to a more secure location for the night. A school building 3 blocks away had been cleared and designated as a temporary holding facility. The 17 Germans rose slowly, their movements still cautious, but no longer quite so fearful. They had been fed, given water, treated with basic humanity. Their worldview, constructed so carefully by years of propaganda, had begun to crack. Jack walked alongside the column as they moved through the ruined streets. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, and somewhere in the distance artillery rumbled, a reminder that the war continued even as this small drama of understanding played out. The older German with the bandaged hand fell into step beside him, silent for several minutes before speaking. "I have a son," the man said quietly. "About your age, perhaps. He is in a POW camp in England. I have not heard from him in 8 months." He paused, struggling with some internal decision. "You are not what they said you were. None of you are." "No," Jack agreed. "We're not. Will you kill us later? After we have been processed, after we reach the camps?" "No." "How can you be certain?" Jack thought about how to answer that question in a way this man would believe. "Because we don't kill prisoners. Because that's not who we are. because we're trying to win a war, not become the thing we're fighting against." The German absorbed this in silence. When they reached the school building, he turned to face Jack directly. "Thank you," he said simply, "for treating us as human." The school had been set up with blankets, additional rations, and a wood stove that provided blessed warmth against the March chill. The prisoners filed in, still watchful but no longer expecting immediate execution. Jack posted guards at the doors and windows, more to prevent escape than to prevent any threat from the Germans themselves. These men were finished with fighting. As the night progressed, Jack made periodic checks on the prisoners. During one such check, around midnight, he found most of them asleep, exhausted by fear, combat, capture, and the mental strain of having their assumptions overturned. But several remained awake, sitting near the stove, speaking in low voices. They fell silent when Jack entered, but he gestured for them to continue. The young German who had cried over the chocolate bar looked up at him. "Is it true that in America, even ordinary people have cars? That there is enough food for everyone?" Jack, who had grown up in Pittsburgh during the Depression, knew that America was not the paradise this kid was imagining. But compared to what these men had experienced, most people have enough to eat, he said. Many families have cars. Not everyone, but many. We were told that Americans were starving, that your cities were falling apart, that the German army was protecting Europe from American barbarism. You were told a lot of things that weren't true. Another prisoner, a man of perhaps 30 with intelligent eyes, spoke up. "How long until the war ends?" "Weeks," Jack said honestly. "Maybe a month or two. The Wehrmacht is collapsing. Your leadership knows it. They're just not ready to admit it yet. And then? And then Germany rebuilds, and you go home to whatever is left." The implications of that statement hung in the air. Whatever is left. These men knew better than the Americans what that meant. They had seen their cities bombed, their infrastructure destroyed, their entire society reorganized for total war. The bill for Hitler's ambitions was coming due, and it would be their generation that paid it. The intelligent-looking prisoner leaned forward. "In the East, the Soviets are coming. We have heard stories. Terrible stories. Is that also propaganda?" Jack met his eyes. "Some of it is probably propaganda, but the Soviets have reasons to be angry. What happens in the East will be different from what happens in the West." Fear flickered across several faces. The older German with the bandaged hand spoke up. "Our families, many are in the East. If the Soviets come, focus on surviving," Jack said. "Focus on getting through this, getting to a proper camp, making it to the end of the war. Then worry about what comes next." It was not the reassurance they wanted, but it was honest. Jack had learned that these men responded better to honesty than to false comfort. They had been lied to for years by their own government. Truth, even uncomfortable truth, was a form of respect. As dawn approached on March 29th, trucks arrived to transport the prisoners to a larger facility 30 kilometers to the west. The 17 Germans emerged from the school building into gray morning light, better rested and fed than they had been in weeks. They lined up without being told, no longer expecting the rifles pointed at them to fire. Jack stood nearby as they loaded into the trucks. The older German paused before climbing aboard, turned back, and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. The young one, who had cried over chocolate, attempted a smile that did not quite succeed but conveyed gratitude nonetheless. The intelligent prisoner simply said, "Dank," before disappearing into the canvas-covered truck bed. Lieutenant Howell appeared at Jack's side. "Division is pleased with our processing efficiency. They want us to set up a FAR collection point here in Brechen. More prisoners are expected as the push continues." "Yes, sir." The old man, the one with the bandaged hand, he asked me to tell you something before they loaded him up. Jack waited. He said, "Tell the sergeant that his son would be proud of how he treats his enemies." Howell paused. I didn't know what he meant. Jack watched the trucks pull away, carrying their cargo of former enemies toward an uncertain but no longer quite so terrifying future. "I told him I had a kid brother, 19 years old, still training stateside. I might have mentioned that I was trying to fight this war in a way that would make him proud." "Are you? Fighting it that way, I mean?" "I'm trying to, sir." Over the following days, the pattern repeated. More prisoners arrived, more men who expected death and found humanity instead. The numbers grew. 43 became 71, then 118, then 243. Each group arrived with the same fear, the same propaganda-induced certainty of imminent execution. Each group discovered the same disconnect between expectation and reality. Word began to spread among the retreating German forces. Surrender to the Americans. Not the Soviets, never the Soviets, but the Americans. The ones with the food, with the cigarettes, with the medical care. The ones who treated prisoners like human beings rather than vermin to be exterminated. It became a factor in German tactical decisions, units positioning themselves to surrender to Western forces rather than face capture by the Red Army. Jack processed hundreds of men through Brechen in those final weeks of the war. He heard their stories, witnessed their relief, saw the moment when propaganda's grip finally released them. It was not dramatic or cinematic. It was simply repetitive and mundane, the slow accumulation of evidence that overwhelmed even the most thoroughly indoctrinated mind. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, Jack Brennan stood in the same town square in Brechen, where he had first told 17 terrified men that they were safe. The war was over. The killing had stopped. Across the continent, millions of prisoners in camps east and west began the slow process of returning to whatever remained of their former lives. Years later, long after he had returned to Pittsburgh and tried to resume a normal life, Jack would sometimes think about those 17 men in the rain. He never learned their names, never discovered what became of them. But he understood that in those moments outside the town hall, when fear met unexpected mercy, something more important than tactics or strategy had been demonstrated. The propaganda had said Americans were monsters. The reality had been water and sea rations and basic human decency. That gap between lie and truth had been wider than the Rhine, more significant than the military victories that filled the history books. The chocolate bar that had made a young German soldier cry. The bandaged hand that had trembled while holding food. The simple words spoken in the rain, "You're safe here." These were the weapons that had won a different kind of war. One fought not with bombs and bullets, but with the harder, slower work of proving through actions that humanity could survive, even the worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. In the arithmetic of that victory, 17 became thousands, and thousands became proof that even in war's darkest chapters, the possibility of mercy remained. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.